I think a key word in Dr. Yancey's work is unreasonable, right? The unreasonable hatred or fear of Christians. Can any of you speak to the unreasonable part there?
Yeah, one thing I'll add is, unfortunately, people don't have to have a reason nor to fear. And so, in my research, I did find people who were fearful of Christians, and it was on things, for example, in the United States, you were talking about Christians setting up a theocracy, which I would argue is not a reasonable fear. There's no real movement towards a theocracy among U.S. Christians, and yet people were actually talking about this. And so that is part of it. I don't consider Christianophobia if, for example, someone had a bad experience with a particular Christian and they don't like that person and probably they don't like Christianity. That happens, and that's unfortunate. But when people have fears of theocracy, when they have hatreds of Christians that are not based in any sort of reasonable setting, that sets us up for Christianophobia and then for the implications thereof.
Yeah, it's really useful to kind of define also what Christianophobia is not. What would any of you say to people who say Christianophobia is a myth? It doesn't exist. What are you guys talking about? How would you respond?
Well, I think actually it may actually make sense that people are having a kind of fear towards Christians or of Christians. But then you have to understand the spiritual nature of this. And then we have to go into biblical terminology, because what the dark powers are afraid of is the light. So whenever a Christian carries out into the world the light of Christ, somebody would get scared. Because if you're living on a lie and you are governed by or you're controlled by dark forces, you don't like the light, because the light will expose who you are and you don't want, to be exposed. So it's so if we are trying to understand this from a spiritual perspective, it actually makes sense that a world who's becoming more and more evil is very afraid of, the love, the goodness, the light that is being brought to the world through the Christians. But then we have to understand it in a spiritual way and not a political way.
I also just want to add, because it is true that particularly this whole dynamics of the kingdom of dark and the kingdom of light, sort of, we're going to say existing in the same space and everything else. And quite often, I think, for example, going back to the thing of why people say it's a myth and probably don't believe it, primarily because quite often when Christians do suffer a lot, it's not something that is easily broadcasted or something that is out there. And quite often, when you do have, let's just say, a student who in the classroom who is disagreeing with the professor who is anti-Christian, and you have that whole dynamic of the kingdom of light and kingdom of darkness in that whole space. And of course, quite often if the professor then penalizes the student because the student simply does not wish to adhere to his or her worldview, then usually that's not really broadcasted out there. And quite often, if anything, it's more of even find that the institutions themselves try to curb it down so that people don't really know much about it. So, but however, if you find that, let's just say, for example, someone who is, let's just say, a transgender, and who then someone says something against, or even a word against that is definitely then broadcasted everywhere. And so you find that quite often the sufferings and the challenges that many Christians have is definitely curbed down, or it's not simply well known out there. And I think just also another thing is just the whole nature of Christian thought of sometimes turning the other cheek, which then does means we don't just simply broadcast much of our suffering, but that does not mean it does not exist.
I want to answer your question, Merzamie. I think I butchered your name. I'm sorry. But I also want to build on what Gabriel just said. The people who tend to have Christianophobia tend to be very powerful in the culture. They tend to be white. In the United States, they tend to be, I don't know how it is in other countries, tend to be white, male, highly educated, progressive, wealthy. And so they control a lot of the cultural elements, media, academia, entertainment. And so what he is saying is true, that when things happen to Christians, you're not going to get the publicity that you're going to get if it happened to a Muslim or to a sexual minority or things of this nature. So that's part of one of the reasons why people don't see it as a problem. The way I answer them when they say it doesn't exist, because I'm a social scientist, is I use data. And so, I go back to my research and I point out, that the level of animosity towards conservative Christians equals that towards Muslims in the United States, and the people who have them, as I just said, tend to be powerful, wealthy, and educated, and male and white. And then I can also use certain events. The Supreme Court, this recent ruling in the Masterpiece Cake Shop, said that the reason why they ruled for the cake shop was that the commissioners showed anti-Christian bias. So the courts have ruled that anti-Christian bias exists. So I use the data that I have. I have the data on bias in academia, that to be a conservative Christian makes you less likely to be hired in academia. So I use data whenever people say it doesn't exist. So that's sort of how I come at it.
Wow. Great news for all of us in academia who are conservative Christians, I'm sure. That is so interesting, because you are able to use data, but there is this challenge. How do you use that data? Because, one of the ways that Christianophobia is manifested can be negative emotions, or what I guess cultural, racial conversations and fields would say are microaggressions. If we use that word to apply, there's a lot of, I suppose, microaggressions that are undetectable. How did you, I guess broadly speaking, how did you measure Christianophobia?
Well, let me be clear that the data is not complete. I mean, I would love to do some more research on this, and hopefully I can get some grant money to do more research on this. But I use survey data to capture attitudes. To look at the biases in academia. I once again surveyed academics. And then I looked at the media, and then I used other surveys to capture attitudes. And so I had people actually answer questions that revealed Christianophobia. Now, something like microaggressions, which I find to be a not well-defined concept, would be hard to capture. But if we're going to use that concept to look at race, to look at sexual minorities, then we can start. There is actually some research out there, not that I did, but someone else did, that shows microaggressions towards Christians as well. So I think that you could document that. I just don't think that's a well-defined concept. And then you talk about privilege, and there is some writings out there on secular privilege, which make a lot of sense. So it's hard to get at some of the more how should I say, subjective elements of it. But as far as attitudes, as far as potential for discrimination, that research is out there.
And I think also one of the most difficult things is that even though we may have data, and presenting that data to people, quite often is that you will meet a huge disbelief, because ultimately you do find in groups that's already made up its mind that such thing does not exist. And and also, I mean, it's let's sort of take almost anything in society, is that when people already have a certain view of what is real, and you can present all this data and everything to show that, guess what, this is what's happening, this is the reality. But quite often is that you will find an opposition or even other reasons why that may not be true. And so I think the challenge also simply presenting the data, making sure that it is presented, that is acceptable. And I think, that is the challenge, particularly when you have people or groups that have already made up their mind.